World War II, British attitude during the Blitz has achieved a semi-mythical status, Blitz spirit, as it's often called. But of course people were losing their families and their homes, and this of course had some pretty strange consequences. For instance, criminals took advantage of the chaos, and there are reports of people posing as air wardens in order to steal from people's houses, and of course people stole a lot from the rubble of other people's houses as well. But one thing I think that people often either ignore or just don't know about is that during the Blitz there was a bit of a sexual revolution, like what happened during the 60s. For instance, in 1941 in the London Life magazine, the cover photo showed girls wearing nothing but underwear and gas masks, and this shows that the pre-war concepts of morality concerning sex had pretty much died, albeit momentarily. There are of course numerous stories, first-hand accounts and diary entries, that sort of thing, that can back me up here. For instance, the Fitzroy Tavern allegedly became more explicitly a homosexual bar. There were numerous affairs going on in the air raid shelters, particularly in the underground. After all, they're all sharing a pretty close space for a long period of time. And there's also reports of prostitutes being found at the side of the streets having sex under upturned carts. But let's say you're not a fan of anecdotal evidence, well, there is some statistics to back me up here as well. For instance, the number of STDs rose by 70% in 1942 as opposed to a couple of years before, and in 1942 there were about 10,000 more illegitimate children born in London than were born in the previous years. And this so worried the authorities that some politicians and even the Archbishop of Canterbury started in 1945 to preach to the people, wanting them to go back to their old pre-war moral standards. By and large, the British people obeyed their orders, and marriage and stuff like that returned to its pre-war standards. But in a way, the Blitz had been like in the early 60s in terms of what it did to sex and marriage. But the British were a little more risque than their American counterparts. For instance, an American soldier reported to an American raised in the puritanical culture of the Great Depression in the US, this open discussion of sex for sale carried out in broad daylight by girls who looked exactly like their wholesome American counterparts was most astounding. He goes on to describe how the women of England, well of London, wore snug clothing and were pleased to titillate the American soldiers out there. He also said that women who weren't prostitutes also talked quite frankly about sex, and in particular was shocked to hear them discuss things like their past and current partners. After all, many of the women who were having little affairs with the Americans were married to British soldiers who were serving overseas.